One, some of us are still here. Two, some of us aren't. Those that were here had two key characteristics. One, they were exceptionally efficient with their balance sheets, i.e. they had the kind of capital depth they needed to make it through. They could go borrow when they needed to borrow, and they had not expanded rapidly in periods of high profitability when it's costly to expand. We're not going to talk about that today. The second thing I learned is those that are still here, and because you're in the room, you have to fit in that category, understood that efficiency was exceptionally important. And they understood, how do I drive efficiency, and really, how do I drive global system efficiency? And I'm going to define efficiency today as really what's the margin per pound. So how do I minimize cost and maximize revenue? And what do I do that? How do I do that efficiently? Now, the problem with these downturns is every time, right? If I lose the bottom 10% or the bottom 20% every time I go through a downturn, the problem is the 80% that are left are pretty good. So guess what? We've gotten all the guys out of this game that have got sows in the backyard with sow huts and all that stuff that occurred in Pike County, Illinois, and the stuff in Henry County, Illinois, where we had sows in A sheds and deep sleep sheds. That's where I first started practice. That's gone. We're now down to the guys who kind of get it. The businesses that kind of get it. And so we got to be better if we're really going to get over that hump. And so how do we do that? So let's talk a little bit about what an efficient sow farm is, because I think that's the most important place we start. If we're going to talk about how do we improve efficiency, we've got to be able to define that efficiency in a way that makes sense to everybody, so we're at least working on the goal that we think we're working on. So this is how I propose that we start talking about efficiency today. And I started this conversation earlier. But if you think about this, right, our goal up here is this bucket. I've said this before, I'll say this 1,000 more times. We keep score in dollars. We do not keep score in PSY, feed conversion, PERS negative status, or anything else. You do not get a gold star for not having a disease. You do not get a gold star for having the highest PSY. No one cares. No one is the banker, by the way. Because, right, he at the end of the day determines if we stay in business often, because this is a high capital intensive business. So if we can't access capital, we can't play this game. And so this game is really defined on how profitable am I. And profit is driven by two buckets, right? Revenue less expenses. So as we think about that, the real question we have to think about, and I like to distill this stuff down so my little pea brain can handle it. Revenue is really how many widgets do I have to sell, and are widgets oink? And how much am I going to get paid for them? And that's not really that complicated, right? You're like, oh boy, who got this clown to speak today? But folks, we make this complicated a lot of times. So what determines how many do I have to sell? Well, that's number. And that number is a function of two things. How many did I put on feed and how many of them died? All right? Those are pretty two easy. Which one of those two is easier to control? How many I put on feed? How many I put on feed is a big deal. I may or may not be able to control the number that died. Right? We get PED, we get other stuff. So what I really got to think about is, am I putting enough on feed to make my revenue targets? Number two, what do they weigh? And what quality are they? Well, I think we can kind of take this quality thing off the mark. Because generally today, right, pigs are all of acceptable quality to the packer, and the premium really is not on that. It's really, quality is really defined, can I hit the weight matrix, and can I drop those pigs in on the right part of the weight matrix? So, i.e., what do they weigh? And when markets are cheap, right, we're not going to spend any time talking about this today, but you heard this alluded to in the first presentation this morning. When markets are cheap, I need to be dropping pigs in at the high end of that packer matrix. And in almost every packer matrix there is, you can ignore sort loss. What you need to calculate is revenue over cost. And I will tell you, at least a third of those pigs on every packer grid need to be over the top of the grid with $3.50 corn. They've got to be heavy going to the plant. Because if I sell a 300-pound pig or I sell a 250-pound pig, that's a 20% difference in weight. Guess what? If I paid $40 for that weaned pig, that pig that weighs 250 pounds has a higher cost by 20% on all those fixed costs that went in the door. So housing, weaned pig cost, vaccines, etc., 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 overhead, i.e. management salary. So heavy weights are really dilutive. That is a big, big, big deal in a low-cost environment, particularly when we have low-cost corn coming in. So I got to have the right number, and I got to get them to the right weight. So how do I do that? Well, let's talk about managing expenses on this side. These are the 4 big buckets of expenses. Those are kind of proportional to each other, although they're slightly off. But in a relatively normal feed market, if I talk about sow cost being the total cost of the sows going into the pig, the weaned pig cost, I've got rent on the barns, I've got labor, and I've got feed. I've got to figure out how do I manage all 4 of those cost buckets most effectively. We're going to talk the rest of the day about how do I manage this bucket. Because I was asked to talk about sows. I'm going to tell you something. Sows are necessary evil, folks. If we could figure out how to clone those mofos, we would not have a bloody sow around. We don't sell sows. We do not sell weaned pigs. We do not sell feeder pigs. We sell 212-pound carcasses. Really, we sell meat. We really sell the components of that meat product. So do not forget that everything in before that carcass is just a cost center. And quite frankly, you could argue all the way to the retail case as a cost center. But from our world that we can control, the only thing that matters is how many pigs do I hang on the rail and what do they weigh. So we're going to talk about this cost bucket because it's about a third of the cost of production. But don't forget the big cost bucket and don't forget this big revenue driver here. So how do I get to efficient sow production? And let's spend the rest of the morning talking about that. But I want to give you some background to the relative importance of this. And if some of you guys just sell weaned pigs in the room, this stuff matters to you too. Because guess what? What you get paid for those pigs is determined on your ability to drive these 3 labor bucket costs in this revenue, or these 3 cost buckets in this revenue piece. So we're going to talk about how do we create an efficient sow farm, what does that mean, and how do we move that down. So this is my definition of an efficient sow farm. Number 1, a sow farm is a cost center. It accrues cost. It does not create value. It does not create profit in the global chain. It merely is a place where cost is accrued. So how do we do that? How do we have it minimize its cost or allow it to create the most value at the end of the day? It's, do I produce the specified number of pigs per unit time? We're going to talk about what that means in a minute. So number per unit time, not total number per year, but number per unit time. Are they the specified quality? And how do we do that at the least cost? Now those things are in that sentence in that order for a specific reason. That is the priority we have to make decisions in. Remember I said the profit or the number of pigs I have to sell is most primarily determined by how many pigs do I place. And the number of pigs I place is really determined by how many pigs does the sow farm make, right? At the end of the day, if the sow farm didn't make them, it's really hard to place them. Now, if you're a big guy, you can go buy pigs, you've got independent sites, you can do some of that kind of stuff. And if you look at the large producers, the integrators, that's really where they have a big competitive advantage, is that they always maintain their revenue number because they're willing to go buy pigs on the side. So a single farm fair to finish unit, not single site, single ownership fair to finish unit that doesn't have the ability to go source those pigs is somewhat limited. Therefore, this ability to drive the sow farm and drive sow farm efficiency becomes even more important because the ability to hold revenue, i.e. the number of pigs sold at the end of the day. So pigs per unit time. After that, what quality are they? Do I have the right quality of the pig? We'll talk about that. And finally, we're going to manage cost of those pigs. But in that order, we have to get that done. If you look at the really bigs, Smithfields, Mash-Off, Iowa Select, Seaboard, Triumph, guess what they're really good at? This number right here. They're kind of good at this, and they talk a lot about this. They're not really very good at this because the sow efficiency isn't that great, i.e. pigs per sow per year isn't that great. But what they understand is that the definition of that efficient sow farm is, did it produce enough pigs to fill the chain? Because that's what drives my revenue number. So pigs per unit time. So why is this pigs per unit time thing important? So when we say unit time, one is, we could call it week, but if I'm batch farrowing, it's really the batch. Number of pigs out of the sow farm should match the batch size of the finishing unit. Remember, we're only in this game to feed pigs, so I've got to match those number of pigs out of the sow unit to the finishing batch. Number two, variation is a killer. So the right number of pigs per unit time per week, let's just call it a weekly system, per week is critical, because guess what? If I didn't wean them last week and I wean them this week, I lost a whole week of feeding in the chain. I've done something, right? I want to market. I've got barns available at the same rate. They kind of grow at the same rate. I boogered up the system because I didn't feed the machine at exactly the same rate all the time. And that efficiency has to be occur throughout the year. So what you've got on this right graph is, this is months. So January to December. This is price on this axis relative to the annual mean price. So this is USDA reported prices received per month. So in January, what you'll see is the price is 10% below the annual average. And in June, the price is 10% above the annual average. There is a price difference of 20% between the top and the bottom of the market every year. Now, you all know that because you've been in the pig business. I want you to think about this. If you say I'm going to wean 1,000 pigs a week, but I do that by weaning 1,200 pigs a week in June, July, and August, or in April, May, and June, and by weaning 800 pigs a week in October, November, December, what's the net impact of my income? I still weaned 1,000 pigs a week for the year. But guess what? Those 1,200 pigs I weaned a week go to market right here. And the 800 pigs a week I put up here. If you do that math, at the end of the day, you're about 4% below on revenue for the year than what if you just weaned 1,000 pigs a week. 4%. $6 a pig. Guess what we're going to make in this industry? We're really good, $10. You're not cost competitive if you can't drive pigs into this market at the same rate that I drive pigs into this market. So annual pigs weaned on average doesn't help you very much from an efficiency standpoint. I've got to deliver the right number of pigs in the right periods to optimize markets, because I've got to sell the same number of pigs here or more pigs here than I sold here and here. So how do you get that done? Well, there's two things you can do. One, I've never gotten anybody to do this, but it makes the most sense to me, so it must be crazy. One, you size the system so that I'm weaning the set number of pigs I need at the least efficient time of the year. So in the late third, early fourth quarter, when I've got historically low production, right? 20% less pigs born, right? We all know that in week 40, magically sows get pregnant if I wave semen under their nose. And in week 38, I have to, I don't know how I get them pregnant. So if I'm in the least efficient time of the year, I size the system, i.e. I plan to farrow enough sows to wean the specified number of pigs. So if that means I need to farrow 112 sows to get 1,000 pigs, that's how many sows I farrow. And if in June I need to farrow 90 sows to get 1,000 pigs, I farrow 90 sows. I flex that number by letting sow crates stand empty. And every sow guy in the room is going, this guy's crazy. You can't let him stand empty. I would argue you absolutely can if you have enough sow space. And the advantage is if you think about culling in those periods, I can do some things with gilt deliveries. I can do some things with differential culling to actually improve the quality of the sow farm, which we've done consistently over time. Strategically remove sows from the herd, reduce parity, improve leg quality, improve quality of the sows. So actually our fourth quarter dip is much less because the sows I'm breeding during the worst part of the year are much better quality. We'll talk about that in a minute. So there's some differential stuff we can do there with respect to culling, but most sow guys just absolutely twitch when they walk in the barn and there's 6 empty sow crates. I ran sow production for quite a few years. I'm in your camp. It drives me crazy. So how else do you do that? Well, we've had a fair number of producers compensating for that number by breeding extra gilts in the summer. And we've been doing that in breeding projects. So if we need to farrow 10% extra sows, remember the problem in the fourth quarter, you got 2 things. One, your farrowing rate tends to stink, and your total born tends to stink. Farrowing rate is a day length thing because sows just don't really want to be pregnant. It's not a temperature thing. It is a day length thing. The photo period is off and they don't like it. In spite of what you said, what we've told you over the years as veterinarians, we have bred sows to come in and heat at day 5 whether they want to come in into heat at day 5 or not. Because every genetic company in the world has selected sows at their nucleus level that if they don't come in and heat at day 5, they're culled. So we have selected almost unitrait selection for short wean to service interval. They will ovulate whether they eat or not. What they will not do is ovulate good quality eggs, and that's really the work the Foxcroft's group in Alberta has done. Is that if they're in wrong day period, or they're in really short energy, they will conceive, or they will ovulate, but they may not conceive, or they may not stay pregnant. So there's a sow effect. That's where the total born impact comes in. So she ovulates, still ovulates 30 eggs, but you get higher fetal mortality or higher embryonic mortality, then we end up with lower litter size. So I got fewer sows farrowing of those that I exposed, and those that farrow have smaller litter size in the fall. So I actually have a huge dip in productivity. So I've got to have more factories showing up, right? I've got to run more machines to make the same number of pigs. So we have done that in numerous systems by doing breeding projects in the summer. We will retain extra gilts. We'll put those gilts in a finisher barn. Start breeding them probably when they're a little too young. Give them one go at semen. If they do not come into heat or they do not get pregnant, they get on a truck. And if I start breeding them kind of light enough and I kind of can be able to restrict feed a little bit, I get some really heavy market pigs, but those gilts that are culled, most of those will still make it on the packer grid, particularly if I'm going to a packer that will accept heavier hooks. So I've now created a way to add gilts to my system without really adding cost. And the efficiency of those girls isn't great, but that isn't the point. The point is, how do I get more sows to farrow so I can capture this market? Again, our first driver is numbers, and this is how we're trying to drive numbers out of the system. So some tricks there if you think creatively about using space, some tricks there about thinking about how do I use gilts appropriately. And the bigger trick there is thinking about how do I measure success. And success here is making sure that I have adequate numbers of pigs so that in October, November, December, I've got enough pigs weaned to hit this market. Too much money on the table not to hit that market. So you've got a bit of extra cost in those pigs because you've got to house those gilts off site, but overall we've been able to net out if the average cost of a weaned pig, let's just say for average is $40, those pigs have cost us about $41, $42. They're worth 10% more, they're worth 15 bucks more, so we're still, 10, 12, 14 bucks ahead margin-wise on those pigs compared to not having those pigs. Or heaven forbid trying to buy them on the open market. So, we talked a little bit about this. I'm going to emphasize 3 key points. Number 1, farrowing rate is not about how you breed, it is about who you breed. If you have a farrowing rate problem, you have a culling problem. If she is lame, and I don't mean like dangling her leg lame, I mean like she doesn't want to stand there square on her back feet at the time of weaning, she's about 15 or 20% less likely to farrow when we looked at that data. If she is thin coming out of farrowing relative to her entry condition in farrowing, so she's a body condition score of 3 at weaning, but she was a body condition score of 4 at entry, that is actually worse than a body condition score of 3 at farrowing coming out of 2.5. the relative delta during the farrowing period, those sows that lose a lot of body weight, they don't farrow either. Guess what? Old sows don't farrow very well, unless they're really super special. And there are a lot of really special, super old sows around. So, if you have a farrowing rate problem, the who, not the how, is important. Who got bred, not how you bred them. If you have a total born problem, you got a how problem, or you got a semen quality problem. But I cannot think of a case where that has not been true over time. So that's where I said thinking about what we're going to breed in those low efficiency times of the year becomes important, because I can't think about it in August. I got to think about that in January when I've got the opportunity to cull, replace the gilt in that farm, make sure I've got the right animal coming into the system so that I'm set up for success in the fall to make sure I've got those right numbers. Number 2, the focus on breeding target is a fool's chase. I do not care if you breed them. I only care if they farrow. Now, I understand that if you do not breed them, they cannot farrow. I got that. I got that part of reproductive biology. But it is critical that you think about, are they really going to farrow? And if I breed her and she is not going to farrow, I think she's not going to farrow, then I shouldn't be putting semen into her. She's going to stand her out and eat feed for at least 3 weeks and probably 6. That's a spot that's being taken up by an animal that could be productive. Or worst case scenario, I'm just feeding her for 6 weeks, which is another $80. So as we're thinking about low-cost times, thinking about where you're at, and am I really breeding animals that are likely to farrow, I will tell you today our farrowing rate expectations on weaned sows are consistently above 90%. Our farrowing rate expectations on gilts are in excess of 95%. We view that we are not meeting targets if we are not at those levels, and we have to continue to tweak the system. Now, are we getting that done all the time everywhere? Nope. Got a lot of work to do. But we know we can achieve that over time because we've proven we've done it once. And if you can do it once, you can do it twice. So these sows are capable of exceptionally high farrowing rates. And so if you're still clipping along in the 80s, we got some work to do there. You've got some work to do there to really drive efficiency of that system, because stabilizing farrowing rate also stabilizes the number you farrow, because it's much easier to predict actually how many I'm going to farrow every week if I can get a higher percentage of those that I expose to have calves, or have pigs, excuse me. The third part is gilts. Quality, quality, quality. Not quantity, quantity, quantity. So we're going to talk about how do we create quality gilts here in a few minutes. But I'm going to go back to this, that the quality of those gilts entering the farm and the quality of those animals from entry, what happens to them from entry to the time of breeding is exceptionally critical. And we look at farms that are highly productive, they get that right. And they get that right over a long period of time. And number 3, we talked about this a little bit, but if you have 1,000 head weaned to finished barns, or 2,000 head weaned to finished barns, and you wean 1,200 pigs for 1,000 spaces, I'm not sure what those 200 extra pigs create in value. Because now I've got to open up another building to get those 200 pigs in there, and guess what that means? If I dumped the last 400 pigs out of that barn a week before I had to dump those 400 pigs out of that barn to get those 200 pigs in there, those pigs ought to be gaining 2 pounds a day at the end. I just took 14 pounds off of 400 pigs, or roughly 6 pounds a pig off of every pig that I sold out of that building. As we think about the revenue metrics, pounds are still critical. And so if I can't dump those pigs on schedule and I'm creating incremental extra pigs that are forcing me to dump barns before I'm ready so I've got a place to place them, that destroys a lot of value for those 200 extra pigs. The other sidebar I would tell you is, you're like, well, yeah, we'll just overcrowd them. We'll just put an extra 200 pigs in here. Then we'll move them the next week. You know, I said you can't control mortality. You're right. Except you can always make it worse, and that's a recipe to make it worse. That is like mixing 101. If you're going to mix pigs, And we have looked at this. I've had the good fortune or the bad fortune, as you may view it, working with some of the biggest systems in the country. They all mix pigs. And I mean, we mix lots of pigs. We are really good at mixing pigs. It's what we do. We spend a lot of time thinking about how do we fill buildings. I'm going to tell you this. Speed matters. Not just at the racetrack. It is mattering how you're filling barns. So you gave me a choice of 20 sources filling a barn on one day or one source filling a barn over 7 days, over 14 days. I'm taking 20 sources every day of the week. Because I know that gives me better results filling an airspace in one day than I do trickling pigs into the building. So I know we like to wean 3 or 4 days a week or 5 days a week because that somehow optimizes farrowing crates and that makes it all better and we feel good about that and we got one extra half a day on wean age and blah, 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 blah. But that really drives that finishing performance in the wrong direction. And if I look at our nursery performance as an industry, it ain't very good. And a lot of that is how we place pigs in those buildings. And so this shuffling and moving and not matching this sow output to finishing output has some big consequences in terms of our grow finish efficiency downstream. So that moves us right into the quality bucket. All right, I said number is number one, quality is number two. What are we going to do with quality? Number one, and this is a critical deal, genetics sets the ceiling. If you ain't got good genetics, it don't matter. Now here's the next piece. I've had the good fortune of being involved in a lot of things to look at a lot of different lines over a lot of time. Not here to endorse any particular set of genetics, but I will tell you this. There is more intra-line variation than there is between-line variation today. So if you want to pick genetic company X, and I want to use genetic company Y, that doesn't determine your effectiveness nearly as much as your ability to make sure you're managing that genetic process and getting the absolute best animals out of that particular given genetic company. i.e., you're following the breeding schemes, you're using all the advanced blunt technology we've got to predict future genetic performance. This is a big deal on boars. Which percentage of the boars we're picking out? Those are real dollar value differences between the top and the bottom percentage on boars. But where I see the biggest gap is everybody gets that right because we kind of buy semen, right? Yeah, okay, we buy semen and somebody's going to manage that for me. Pick your genetics boar stud supplier, they'll take care of that or I manage it myself. That kind of works. Where we fall behind is on sows. And so if we aren't doing the things to make sure that our pure animals at the top of the pyramid are maintaining and have the minimal genetic gap from the top of the nucleus pyramid within the given genetic company, we are in trouble. Small herds doing closed herd multiplication, the gap can often be 3 to 4 years more than farms using commercial multiplication where they are tied tightly to the genetic nucleus of the company. And I know why those decisions get made because, we can raise gilts a bit cheaper or we can manage health or whatever it is. And I get all those things. But what I'm telling you is most of the genetics companies today are improving in excess of 0.2 pigs per sow per year. 1% improvement sow productivity. Some are as high as 2 or 3%. If you are 6 years behind, you're by definition 6 to 7% behind on pigs per sow per year, sow efficiency. You're 6 to 7% behind on feed efficiency on the sow side. And remember, that sow contributes half of the feed efficiency of the grow finish pig. So keeping the genetic lag the tightest is the biggest deal in terms of managing genetics. And understanding that variation is exceptionally critical. And managing that as a farm manager is one of the most important decisions you can make. Am I staying tight to what the genetic potential of that given line is? And if I do that, I know I'm going to be competitive. If I don't, I'm not leaving nickels. I'm leaving, $3 to $5 to $10 bills on the table for pigs. And remember, we're only making $10 in this industry. If we're trying to sort out the bottom 20%, here's the way I know I can ratchet my way back up and make sure I've at least not lost that bucket. So that's number one. Genetics sets the ceiling. Number two, health allows you to touch the ceiling. If health is terrible, you cannot maintain the maximum genetic potential of those animals. So what is terrible health? Well, the good news is we're not like Europe. We don't have APP roaming everywhere, so we got rid of that generally. By and large, at least type 1. We still got the PERSs. And I will tell you what, I'm going to the PERS meeting this weekend. And my mom asked me last night, she goes, why are you going to that PERS meeting? I think you've worked on that for 20 years and you haven't made any progress. I said, thanks, Mom. It's a bit of a running joke, but it's not a running joke, right? We don't see that. I mean, it's better than what it was, and we're getting better, and we understand how to manage it, but it ain't going away. But the ticket becomes, how do I minimize the number of positive pigs weaned out of this sow farm? That really becomes the quality, because at the end of the day, I can do some things to manage immunity at the sow farm level, but what I can't have is A, blowouts, so I don't wean pigs, numbers, or two, that I have a lot of weaned pigs that are weaned infected. Same goes for PED. Same goes for mycoplasma. I don't have to be negative for those things, but I've got to have the minimum number of pigs weaned out of that system positive over time if I'm going to optimize grow finish performance. So it's about how do I create stability, and there's some areas in this world that we need to run those farms negative because of their cost structure. If they're in the middle of South Dakota, they're in southern Kentucky and Tennessee, they're fighting a corn basis that we probably can't compete. So their health competition becomes, how do I run things negative? Because that really becomes a core competitive advantage for them. But sitting here in the heart of the Midwest, that doesn't have to be your competitive advantage, but I got to have a strategy, and I got to have a plan, and I got to keep it at a dull roar. And I got to continue to push to say, what cost choices am I willing to make to keep it at a dull roar? And here's the third part, and I alluded to this. I don't care what age they're weaned at. If you take a week's worth of weaning and you put them in the same building, and you wean them 1 day a week, you wean them 4 days a week, guess what? The spread of age in that barn is exactly the same. If I wean them on Monday or I wean them on Friday, if they went to the same building, the age spread in that building is exactly the same, and that's what matters. Because that's really going to determine what my marketing window looks like. So we don't want really young pigs, I get that. But 17-day-old pigs are not a disaster. And 28-day-old pigs are not all hugs and roses. I have successfully seen us kill 24-day-old pigs at a really high clip. It can be done. You would think you couldn't, but by God, we can figure out how to get it done. And I've seen us raise 17-day-old pigs at a really good clip. We minimize age variation by minimizing number of ferret variation, which goes back to how many did I breed variation. The sow farm controls this, and we have to think that way to say, I can't control weaning age variation at weaning. I have to control it when I start the process, which is at breeding. So I've got to think about, how do I breed the same number of sows every day or every week? And if I'm going to wean twice a week, it's not a weekly breeding target, it's a twice a week breeding target. So that I can deliver the same number of sows to farrowing so I don't screw up my age variation coming out. Guess what finishing guys can't handle? They can handle pigs that are all 21 days of age, or all 17 days of age, or all 28 days of age. But they really don't like an average age of 21 days when some of them are 28 days and some of them are 17. Because those cats are different. Really different in the wean barn. And so how do I get that age variation narrow? And how do I think about solving that in breeding? And that's really a critical piece for us in the sow unit. We've gone back to weaning a lot of sow farms 1 time a week. The first 20 weeks it sucks on wean age. From that point forward, we're actually doing better managing wean age than when we were not weaning once a week. That was all post PED, right? We had PED farms, we went to weaning once a week, or we didn't wean for 4 or 5 weeks. Then we started weaning once a week, trying to minimize trucks so we didn't have trucks running in and out of units so we could minimize our truck risk. And we've kept a lot of those farms on once a week weaning because it's really made the sow farms better, and actually it's made grow finish performance better because I'm now dropping big chunks of pigs at one time into finishing units instead of dribbling pigs in there all the time. So we talked about boars, we talked about gilts. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. We talked about matching farrowing numbers to barn design. Here's the other thing that is a personal pet peeve of mine, and PED taught us this, but we slipped back. Why in God's name would we build all these expensive finishing barns to run all in, all out, and accrue all that cost at grow finish of dumping barns and leaving space set empty and selling pigs light because I don't want to put pigs back into a unit until I've emptied it. Heck, we run sites all in, all out. I got 8,000 in finishing sites. We're going to dump them and reload them. It's a lot of open space days. Why would I do that and then go upstream and just run this little continuous flow circle? Where I just spread cooties equally. Folks, maternal antibody doesn't protect against much. In fact, I can't think of anything that it prevents. We prove that with trying to wean pigs at 14 days and still having disasters downstream. Pigs become infected, but they don't show disease, even if they're still unmummified. So the more I move them in the farrowing house, the more likely I am to contaminate them with whatever is going on there. And that stuff moves all over. It moves on hands. But if I've got old pigs standing next to young pigs, or better yet, I've got young pigs standing next to empty crates that I'm going to power wash, I have just put a fine layer of poo over the top of the baby pigs that I thought were going to be healthy. And a guy explained to me, oh, no, we put up a curtain. So I said, good. Let's go watch that little process. So the curtain was this far from the ceiling. And guess where that nice hot water power washer vapor went? Right over the top of the curtain, right back on the other side. So they didn't get the direct big globs. So we didn't get the big chunko turd, which we normally get. But we got all this fine mist, which is actually where all the bacteria are and all the viruses are, right back on top of those pigs. So whatever respiratory diseases were going on in the older pigs, I have now just contaminated the younger pigs with. So being able to manage these units all in, all out by space needs to start at farrowing, if I'm going to be effective in managing that health downstream. The fourth piece is cross-fostering, and PED taught us a lot of this. I will tell you right now, if I'm going to sell 80% of what's born, and that's really how we have to look at this, not what's pre-weaning mortality or what's stillborn rate or what's finishing mortality, but of the percent born, of the pigs born, what percent did I hang on a rail? If I'm going to sell 80% of them, 20%, right, that'd be really good, actually. So if we had 15% losses of total born, which would be pretty typical today, that'd be really quite good. So 5% stillborns and mummies, 10% pre-weaning mortality with a 15.5, 15.6 total born. Our best farms will do that. That's about as good as we can get. As total born goes up, right, stillborns and mummies actually go up a bit as a percentage because of uterine crowding. If we got that number and then we only lost 5% of them in finishing, weaned and market, we think that was like knocking the bloody cover off the ball. Deads and culls together, so culls are equals to deads. So if I sold 80% of what I had, I would much rather have 5% growing pig losses and 10% pre-weaning mortality than I would 5% pre-weaning mortality and 10% growing pig losses. Because guess what he cost me at 3 days of age? It cost me sow feed, sow genetics, and semen. Once I wean him, I'm now just committed a $20 space to him, wean to market, or at least $20. I've committed vaccine cost to him. I've fed the sow and lactation, although that's probably free because I was going to feed the sow anyway. And I probably put starter diet in front of him. So because I've already allocated that starter diet, right, to that barn. So I have just tacked about a $40 bill on that guy's head when I wean him. Not much I can do about it. So if he dies after weaning, I've got $40 higher costs than if he dies before weaning. If he dies at 200 pounds, I basically tacked on his full market value at that point. So $150. So I need to think about how do I run my farrowing house to minimize grow finish mortality, which means I probably don't want to cross-foster pigs. And we learned we can do that without PED. Most of our farms today, we will not cross-foster after 24 hours of age. And we only move pigs for numbers. So if a sow has 17 pigs and the sow next door has 13 pigs, we might move 2 pigs off and put them both at 15. But we don't size them. We don't do any of that jazz. And I will tell you, in the heat of PED, when we didn't move any pigs at all, which was very routine in our group, sow farrows, what's born there stays there. You would be surprised at the number of pigs that we can wean, number of sows can wean 16 or 17 pigs. And they're not bad pigs. So what we learned, one, we can't count teats very well. We don't understand how many functional teats are on a sow worth a darn. Practically, we can't estimate that. Number two, our sows have much higher capacity at raising pigs than what we thought. And number three, we ran 12 to 14% pre-weaning mortality by not moving any pigs. I have a lot of farms, we can't run 12 to 14% mortality moving pigs. The take home is, guess what? They need go-go juice day one. They've got to get colostrum on board, and that colostrum is not about antibodies, that colostrum is about energy. And if I get adequate energy into them the first 24 hours, really in the first 5 to 6 hours, they don't burn brown fat, their immune system stays together, and guess what? They do really quite well. Every one of the mortality studies I've looked at are almost always starve-out pigs. Low-energy pigs end up with no immune system, end up dying of secondary diseases. So think about how we manage colostrum, not how we move pigs, and you'll have a huge impact on quality of those pigs out of the system. It's a little bit about what we talk about gilts, and I'm not going to spend any time on this, but we have to think about gilt management from literally weaning forward. If we start out here at 200 days of age, we're going to really be in trouble. Quality gilts at breeding have several things. One, I want to not beat them up after I select them. Number two, I want to make sure that they've gotten exposed to things, whatever the farm bugs are, and there's a lot more things than we can measure. So we're learning this as we get more advanced technology, but I want to expose them to things long before I want them to think about coming into heat. If they are off feed or not exposed to things when they're coming in, or exposed to things when they're coming into heat, we know that their performance as a gilt is going to be relatively poor. Probably 10 to 15% on pre-weaning or on conception rate, and probably another at least a pig on total born. So getting those animals acclimated appropriately is exceptionally important. We want them bred at 300 pounds. Talk about why that 300 pound number is important, but we bred them 300 pounds second estrus, and I sure don't want them exposed to things after they get pregnant, because then they're still shedding at the time of weaning, and now I get sick baby pigs, or sick pigs in growth finish. So I got to think about acclimating these gilts very early in the process. So let's talk about cost for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap this up. Here's the real kind of core numbers. But number one, if we just assume a weaned pig costs $40 or is worth $40 for easy math, and 6 to 7 of that is the building cost. So R&M, depreciation on the building, and electricity. And that may be a little light right now, but that's kind of close, but let's just use that number, and I use $7 for here. A 5% change, if I increase pigs by increasing the number of sows, I change cost by about 35 cents because I only dilute this $7 cost. If I can have the same number of pigs with 5% less sows on the farm, I save about $1.65. So there's a 7-fold difference roughly, right? 6-fold difference, difference. But if I can have 5% increase in pigs without increasing sows, I've got about a $2 bill. Pigs per sow per year matters, folks, only because it's dilutive to all the variable costs on the farm. So it dilutes sow cost, it dilutes feed cost, it dilutes labor cost, dilutes sow vaccines, and it dilutes gilt acclimation cost. So pigs per sow per year drives this cost bucket. So I can get more pigs by increasing sows, but what I really want to do is get at least the same number of pigs or more pigs with fewer sows. So it's about how do I drive efficiency. 5% is right about 1 pig per sow per year, a little less than 1 pig per sow per year. 0.6 pigs per sow per year if I'm at 30. So PSY only matters in how I size the system and what my cost efficiency metrics are to be dilutive in all those costs. We're going to talk about how do we drive those efficiency numbers. One, let's talk about feed. So as I think about cost on a sow farm, I think about them in 3 big buckets: feed, labor, and gilt replacement cost. So how many gilts have I got on the farm? So let's talk about feed usage or feed costs. So how do I drive feed costs? We can talk a little bit about managing feed costs. This is obviously where we like to go first. I would tell you that if you've got a reasonable nutritionist, they've spent a lot of time trying to manage this. There are some additive things you may want to think about over time. There's some composition things you want to may think about over time, i.e. which alternative ingredients I'm using. But again, we tend as an industry to do quite well on this. And I want to make sure I'm not overfeeding relative to needs of those sows. But what I would see more often than not today is we actually underfeed, particularly in lactation, than we do overfeed because we get worried about cost. So I'm going to take this off the bucket because I think generally our nutritionist friends do quite a nice job making that happen. This is where I think as an industry we tend to not be very good. So we need to think about usage, and so let's talk about where do the gaps happen in usage. One, if you're trying to manage lactation feed usage, you're smoking dope. The most important thing we can do on a farm is to get sows to eat in lactation. I will tell you right now, sows, I did not believe this. My dear friend Dr. Walter shoved it down my throat, Riley Walter, and I thought he was on crack, but he was right. Sows will tolerate full feed from day one. Sows need to be on full feed from day one, just full feed sows from day one. If you do not have automated sow feeders in front of sows today to give them access to full feed all the time, you are giving up lots of pounds of weaned pigs and lots of pounds of total boredom the next time. We can routinely get sows to gain weight during lactation with self-feeders today and the appropriate diet. So lactation feeding is exceptionally critical. It is not a point to try to save feed. We need to make sure they have access. We have looked at this. If you're not using self-feeders, if you are, you realize this. Sows, for about 6 months out of the year, eat about 75% of their feed between midnight and 6 in the morning. The vast, vast majority of consumption occurs overnight. Unless y'all going to go feed sows 4 times between midnight and 4 in the morning, there is no way you can get enough feed in them. They've got to have feed access in front of them. And that's been, if I look at the big rate change steps we've done, I don't care what kind of sow feeder you use, whether you use the Intac or the SowMax or the tube, or there's 20 of them out there. They all work. I work with all of them. They're all fine. But self-feeders are critical in these sows today, so they have access 100% of the time in front of them. Gestation is where we got to think about it. So how do we know where we're at on gestation feed usage? One, what are we doing with body condition management? I continue to see a lot of sows today as I tromp through sow farms that tend to be over-conditioned going into farrowing. So they're a 3 1/4 instead of a 3, or 3 1/2 instead of a 3 1/4. That sow's eating, typically that means she's eating about 0.2 of a pound a day more than what she needs. That 0.2 of a pound a day is roughly 100 pounds of sow a year. So at $200 a ton, right? It's $5 or $6 in sow feed cost a year that we're wasting. We got to think about. So there's some sow feed wastage there. I've got to get body condition management right. Number 2, and this is the big item, how many non-productive sows are standing around the farm? So non-productive sows are sows that are not likely to have another litter. So sows that we skipped, young parity sows that we skipped at weaning because I want to put body condition back on them, are not unproductive sows. They're highly likely to have another litter and actually probably going to pay their freight because they're likely to have 2 pigs more. So thin sows at weaning, they get skipped based on Foxcroft's work, have about 2 extra pigs in the next litter, which pays the freight to keep her around for 21 days not doing anything. Doesn't make a lot of money, but you will keep her in the herd, which is a big deal. The non-productive sows are those sows that don't come into heat by day 6 or 7. Those sows that abort, those sows that have irregular returns, those sows that preg check negative, etc., etc., etc. Having a really hard look at those girls is exceptionally critical to minimize that inventory. Our best farms will run less than 1% of inventory as quote-unquote non-productive sows, or opportunity sows, whatever you want to call them. They are exceptionally vigilant on getting those sows on a cull truck every week. To get them out of there, let them quit eating feed, minimize that feed usage. So again, it's not a huge number, but these things in cumulative make a big difference on what we're going to do in terms of sow productivity. The third bucket on here in terms of usage becomes replacement rate. Guess what? If I increase replacement rate, guess what that does to my sow usage, my feed usage? By definition, it goes up because I got gilt standing around eating feed. Somewhere, whether they're eating feed in that sow farm, whether they're eating feed in the finisher, I got gilt standing around eating feed for that period from marketing to breeding that they would not normally be eating feed in my system. So if I increase replacement rate, by definition, I'm going to increase sow gestation usage. Whether it shows up in a report or not, it's a whole other deal. And trust me, every system in the world has tried to game that. Oh, no, we bring them in the day before we breed them so we don't use that feed. Don't care, she ate feed somewhere. So if I can think about ratcheting down gilt replacement rates, that has a big deal on my ability to drive to overall feed usage in that farm. How do I drive down replacement rate? Well, I got to retain them more to parity 4 or parity 3, however you want to measure that. Talk about that in a second, but gilt retention becomes a critical issue, not just on gilt cost, but my ability to lower replacement rates. Our goal on most sow farms today is to be able to run farms at 45% replacement rate. At one point, we thought we could get in the 30s. We don't believe we can do that today, at least with currently where we're at on technology. So we'd like to see it in the 45% range. A lot of farms I work with are still in the 55% range, and so that's one of our real action plans for the next year, to say how do we screw down the replacement rate, mostly to minimize feed usage, but it's going to take some real work on the back end to get us prepared to make that happen. Talk a little bit about optimizing farm labor. This is always a sticky wicket, but I want to ask the question, are all the tasks that you're doing creating pigs? It's a bit of a rhetorical question, but it's a question every time I walk through a sow farm or walk through sow farms I work with very routinely. Why are we doing that? Is that doing anything to generate pigs? Or is that just something we've always done? That becomes a really critical thing. Now, this has been taken to the extreme because I've had guys say, well, we stopped power washing because we didn't think it made any pigs. Nope, not the conversation we're having. So this isn't a get rid of everything we don't like to do conversation. It's like, no, we're just going to quit castrating. I don't like that. I'm not sure that makes pigs. No. That's not what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is going back and looking at how do we move sows in gestation? How do we load farrowing rooms? How do we organize the day? How do we wean pigs? Are we given extra steps during the day that we don't necessarily need to do? And I've never been on a farm that we couldn't strip some labor hours out of that farm to try to make the day more efficient. The side benefit of that is that your people are much happier when you make that happen. Number 2, you've got a big drag if you've got a lot of staff turnover. We do not have time to talk about how do I minimize staff turnover, but staff turnover is a huge deal with respect to labor efficiency. You're spending all your time training. We spent a lot of time this winter working with a couple of 3 systems, figuring out how do we take their staff turnover rate. I almost said replacement rate, but how do we take their staff turnover rate from the 60s to the 30s? I'm not sure that's realistic, but there are a lot of good people in the industry trying to help us figure out how do we get that driven down to a level that can really have an impact. And that's really a labor cost thing and an efficiency thing. What are we doing with respect to production schedules? And this gets back to the once-a-week weaning. We've actually dropped farm labor significantly by going to once-a-week weaning because we've got our crews divided up. I have to have less good people. My good farrowing people can go breed and vice versa. They get less bored. So we've thought about how do we work through production schedules, how many days a week do we wean. But the caveat with all these things is, and this is the power washing deal, don't cut off your nose to spite your face. This is likely a 10 to 15 cent a pig savings. It's not a big deal unless you're really out of line. But it's something you have to look at because it's one of your big cost buckets. And here's the last one, and that's on gilt efficiency. I'm going to hammer this home because it's a big deal, and I see a lot of systems screwing it up. 1, a $10 increase in gilt cost. So that the cost of that gilt entering farrowing is $10 higher. I've just increased wean pig cost by 30 cents if I only get 35 pigs per sow per year, 35 pigs per sow per lifetime out of her, which is pretty industry average today. So driving up gilt cost is a big deal. How do I drive up gilt cost? The biggest criminal to this whole thing is age-weighted breeding. There is a reason we like gilts to grow like weeds and get them bred at 300 pounds at less than 200 days of age. We really like to do that, and we're very successful with it. So if we have to get gilts to 240, 250, 260 days of bred, and over 300 pounds, that adds a tremendous amount of cost to those gilts, often 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 bucks. We've got an increased cost in those gilts merely because how we raised them prior to breeding. When we've looked at every study on the face of the earth to say, can we give those gilts more space and grow out? Do we need to feed them extra special fancy diets? Blah, blah, blah. We can't ever get any of those practices to pay off because it adds more than $10 or $15 a head to gilt cost, and we don't get the extra pigs per sow per year per lifetime out of them. Our basic program on gilts today is 1, grow them as finishing pigs until they hit about 220 pounds, 230 pounds. Move them to 12 to 14 square feet. So they've got spread out at that point. That allows the remaining finishing pigs in those pens to make it to weight so we can optimize. Remember, you're selecting 60% of the gilts, 40% of those are still going to get hung on a hook, and so we've got to get that. We will feed different calcium phosphorus diets to those gilts and during the growing period because it doesn't cost us a ton of money. We do not add the sow vitamin trace mineral packs until really those gilts get closer to breeding. And this all gets back to the point, I can't afford to put extra money in those gilts if I don't get a return on it. And quite frankly, we're just not very good at getting the return on those practices. So managing that cost is a big deal. Number 2, if they enter the herd, I need to get them bred, but I need to get that done within the 30-day window. So if she's scheduled to get bred after her available date, she needs to get bred the next 30 days, or she probably needs to get on a cull truck because she's never going to have a litter. So the object isn't here to bring them in and feed them and feed them and feed them, and at 914 days of age, they finally get pregnant. That doesn't happen. So I need to bring them in, get them exposed, have a plan, move that forward. But that percentage is a big deal. And once I bring her into the sow farm or commit to her being a gilt, I probably got a $100 bill attached to her head. You look at the amount of feed we're going to spend, and then we got vaccines and time and people and all that jazz. And then if they get pregnant, if they get bred, they need to farrow. I probably get $180 for those gilts that don't have a litter. So thinking about how do I optimize, and you need to work that through system by system, and this takes a lot of time. And I will tell you, as I go work on farms, this is where we spend most of our time today because it's hard. But it's a big deal because if I can change that rate by about 10%, it's 50 cents a pig. And that's actually quite a big number. After feed, that's probably the next biggest number we can drive out of the system. So what are those key points? And we'll talk about this. 1, they don't get prettier when they get older. Their legs get uglier because we find every OCD lesion that was ever created in their stifle and in their hock. And I will tell you, they all have OCD lesions. So osteochondritis is a bone growth defect. As fast as pigs grow today, they all have some degree of that. So if you think about kids or boys in particular that grow really, really fast and have sore knees, pigs have exactly the same problem. They will heal up if we do not traumatize them, so we try not to move them. But if they are ugly at 260 pounds, they ain't going to get any prettier. They will get lamer and grosser as they get older. I will also tell you, if they are supposed to breed 50 gilts a week, you can't select 42. So selection is not positive selection, it's negative selection. It's which ones don't I want, because I still have to make numbers. Remember, numbers is still the quality, is still the driver of this whole thing. But thinking about how I select, and that really starts up the chain. And number 2, after I select them, 1, they got to have space, so I cannot put them at 8 or 9 square feet. They better be at 12, 14, 15 square feet to allow them to express estrus. Minimizing mixing is a big deal. I do not care if they are crates or pens. We can get equal performance out of either one of those. I hear all these conversations about we need a crate break and we need to do this. I can't measure we make any more pigs with that in the real world. I know that's what the research studies say, but in the real world, we can't do it. It's how you do it's more important than what you do. So do you do it correctly? And number 3, they got to eat. You cannot take weight off gilts after you say, oh, by the way, I'm going to breed these. Gilt flushing is real. And it drives total born and farrowing rate. So we've got to get feed intake in those girls. So if I'm knocking them off feed in the 21 days ahead of breeding with vaccines or mixing them or shoving them in a crate or blah, 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 If I knock them off feed, there will be reproductive consequences to that. I gotta keep them on feed, so I gotta think about that. And the last one is the big deal, and it's the hardest one, which is people. My best people on the farm need to be working with and breeding gilts. No offense, but any trained monkey can breed a weaned sow today. They will get pregnant at a high rate. It ain't that hard. I will tell you, on many big farms, 5,000 and 6,000 we work with, one guy does the breeding on sows. We use tarp straps, we use other things, we'll go down, we have one guy heat check, we may have a helper coming along, but the only decision has to be made breeding weaned sows is she in heat or is she not in heat? So if I have that guy do that, but guess what? To breed gilts, you gotta know what you're doing. I separate out the men from the boys pretty quick breeding gilts. They're in heat for a shorter period of time, their estrus isn't as strong, it's much harder to detect, and they're much more flighty to that pressure. So my best breeding people, and I will put my hand up and tell you, I am terrible at breeding. I have ADHD. I'm really good at the first 2. The next 6, I'm terrible at. Because I'm thinking about 9 other things. Oh, sow, yeah. I am not a good breeder. I fully admit that. But there are people who are fantastic breeders. And we need to go put them in front of gilts. Because that's really where I can make a difference with those guys. I know it's fun to do sows because they all get pregnant. But my best people got to be in front of gilts. Trying to get those gilts. So all the other stuff, end of day, not important.